I'm delighted to support the Together movement. They're a great organisation bringing awareness to the public about a large number of issues. And one of the issues that we both campaign on is excess deaths. And one aspect of that is the situation around the deaths of vulnerable elderly at the beginning of the COVID pandemic. I've been approached by a number of relatives who claim that their relatives, their loved ones, were in fact euthanized, and evidence has been passed to me regarding a change to NICE guidelines in April 2020, authorized by Matt Hancock, effectively NG163, NICE guideline NG163. I've spoken to eminent, recently retired scientists who worked on the replacement for the banned Liverpool Care pathway in 2014, which I believe was NICE guideline 31, and its implementation. So I'm very, very concerned that vulnerable elderly people were moved out of hospital, possibly without their medications and treatments, to care homes in early 2020 to make way for the first wave of expected COVID patients, and that their treatment may have been totally inappropriate. They may have effectively been abandoned in care homes, probably deteriorated, as you'd expect. If they were in hospital, they were in hospital for a reason, especially if they didn't get their meds sent with them, and that they were effectively put on an end-of-life pathway, another version of the Liverpool pathway, which we in Parliament voted to outlaw in 2014. There is considerable evidence that that is what has taken place, and I've been privy to a lot of correspondence with ministers, evidence passed to me by relatives. I held a meeting, I think it was back in June last year, in Parliament, and received about 50, more than 50 concerned bereaved relatives, and I listened to their evidence and their statements for several hours, and it was deeply concerning and deeply moving, and it's an issue which I'm still working on. I actually wrote to the government last year and put in written parliamentary questions, which you can see they should be visible. I asked the government to give me the number of vulnerable elderly that were moved out of hospital in March and April 2020 and moved into care homes and nursing homes. And I also asked then, the supplementary question was, and how many of them had died within 7, 14, 28 days, 56 days, 72 days of A, on their death certificate, COVID-19, and B, other causes. And I was very disappointed with the government's answer, which I find unbelievable. They came back and said they don't hold any of that information centrally. So what the government are telling me is they have no idea how many vulnerable elderly were moved out of hospital in early 2020 to make way for those expected COVID patients, and they've got no idea what happened to them. Well, I think the people I've spoken to, the relatives of those who believe their relatives were euthanized, I think we do know what happened to them, and I think the government is deliberately suppressing information around this issue. And it's interesting that NG163 has been amended numerous times over the last few years. Its name's been changed, and indeed it's no longer being prescribed for anxiety. So anxiety, and you come into hospital, if you've got anxiety, you effectively could have been put on a death pathway if you're over the age of 18, which again is a pretty inexplicable guideline from NICE. So there's lots of questions, not many answers. And I also worry that until we put a stop to these protocols, these euthanasia, if it's happening in our hospitals, is going to be continuing. I'm aware of two colleagues, and I won't name them, from the House of Commons, who both had very, very serious life-threatening illnesses, and they were in hospital near their constituencies, and a colleague of mine, well, colleagues of mine found out that they'd actually been put on the death pathway themselves. They are both in St Thomas's Hospital now and recovering. And I think, that's pretty close to home when members of Parliament who are still alive today were actually put on on a death pathway by the NHS.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew. I think everything you've said, you know, will resonate with the families, other families, not just those that you saw in June last year, but many other families that we have come in contact with. And as you know, my own mother was put on the care pathway. She was originally put in the care pathway in 2019. I refused and nursed her back in her care home. There wasn't staff in the care home to look after her properly, but I managed to do that. And then in 2021, she ended up in hospital in another region. That was this was Cambridgeshire, and I was denied access. I was told she wasn't eating and drinking enough to sustain life. But then I discovered when I got in, when they phoned me 7 days later to say she was dying, and she was end days, that they had not been helping her to sustain her food and fluid intake. And this is a pattern that is repeated again and again and again. And it's interesting, I mean, you focused on the NG 163, and which we know that then became 191, I think, in 2021. And then, as you said, it was amended quite kind of under the radar in the end of November, the 30th of November.
30th of November. It was. I've got the amendment.
Yeah. And campaigners are wondering why suddenly, after 2 years, and this is, you know, one of the consultants we've spoken to has also kind of questioned this. Why would you suddenly do it after 2 years, and 2 years too late? Because, as he said, the amount of people that probably died as a result of that protocol are probably in their thousands. And
absolutely, I think that is a very good written question I could put into the government, to the Department of Health. But whether, as you'll see, whether I'm getting any answers or not is debatable. But I think it's laughable to say that the government don't know any of the figures I asked them for, because if I were running the health service, that's exactly what I'd want to know. I think that publicity, investigation, and transparency, they're the best disinfectants we could possibly have. And you know, too many things are not being reported. Too many things are going on which are being kept under the radar, and bad things go on in dark places.
Protocols, Andrew, because you were saying, you know, NG 163 has been replaced. It's got 191 now. The drugs have been removed from that, but there's still the reference to NG 31, which was introduced, I believe, in 2015. And the problem is not so much the protocols, but how they're being abused,
how they're being interpreted. Yes, and exactly. It would appear that modern medicine, clinical medicine, is being in hospitals is being run no longer on the discretion of doctors, but all about, have you adhered to the guidelines? And as long as you adhere to the guidelines, it doesn't seem to really matter what happens to the patients. The clinicians will be deemed to have done the right thing. Well, if those guys, if that's the prescriptive way we're running medicine now, if those guidelines are erroneous or wrong, the results could be catastrophic, and I think they probably have been.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. And, you know, Sam Ahmadzai, who talked from the audience on our event the other night, I mean, he made this point, you know, that, you know, he's been practicing for 30 years. He doesn't practice euthanasia. He uses those drugs in combination in the very end days of life when somebody is in great pain. And I don't think anyone on the panel or anyone in the audience would have really disagreed with that, apart from maybe Pulicino, who said, you know, these drugs should never be used in the elderly. There was a kind of point of difference between the two medics. But what both of them agree is that the Liverpool care pathway never went away, that it's still driving practice within the NHS. And I think one of the things that we discussed, you know, on Wednesday was the culture within the NHS, the ageism in our society, but also reflected in the NHS and how the elderly are treated. I mean, I mentioned one case during the evening of a lady who's been inhaled. She's 89, but she was very fit. She'd been active, out guarding the day before, and she's been denied a food tube. And the fact she has not been fed now for 1 month. She's dying of.
Well, we would all be dying.
Yeah.
No matter how fit you are, if you're not fed for a month and they reduce your fluid intake, you're going to die.
Yes.
And that's a medical certainty. And I'm very concerned about this assessment that patients have when they arrive in hospital. If you score a certain amount of points, you're immediately going to be put onto the death pathway and not treated.
Exactly, and that's the clinical frailty score, and anything above 5, and you would have been kind of fast-tracked. And the combination of the clinical frailty scale and a DNR, which during the pandemic and since is no longer about resuscitation, it's become shorthand for do not treat, remove fluids, decline fluids, decline food, and then put people on the drugs when they're so weak they can't fight back anymore. And, you know, that has been the kind of process. And my mother was put on that process again, as I said, in 2021. And it was only by going through the court of protection that I was able to get my mother home. Now, that on her discharge notes, it said maximum 3 weeks, but probably 3 to 4 days. My mum at home lived for another 14 months, you know. And my case.
Well, we want to. I thought we had a national health service, not a national death service.
Yes, exactly. And that's what, you know, people are now, the elderly are now fearing going into hospital. You know, as I said, in this case of the lady with the food tube, the doctor said, well, if your mother was 60, we'd be treating her differently. He actually said that. And also said, it's not your decision to make, it's our decision. We have the expertise, you know, and the NHS constitution, as I brought up on Wednesday, it's very clear that the family should be involved in the decisions. And
absolutely
they ground this by saying, by telling you about the decision we've made, we are consulting you. That's not consultation.
And this frailty scoring, I'm told that some of the doctors are doing it in 60 seconds.
That wouldn't surprise me, because if you have dementia, you'll be 6 and 7. So you're above 5, and it doesn't matter what your comorbidities are, or your, you know, doesn't matter if you're terminal or not terminal. And that's another problem, is that we have it on record from a medic within the NHS that for the elderly, COVID was being treated as a terminal disease.
And what we're also aware is that it's not just a UK problem. This was happening in Ireland. It's been happening all around the developed world, where we have a sophisticated medical system, and it all happened following on from the COVID pandemic.
And what do you think is driving this, Andrew? I mean, I feel it's, I agree with Kevin Newell, who was also on the panel, who talked about social utility, this idea that the elderly are no longer socially, you know, useful. And therefore, you know, we have to prioritize care for the young, and in the context of reduced resources. I mean, he didn't agree that you know, we have reduced resources. I think we do. I think, you know, the NHS does waste money, but it certainly needs more money if it's to care for the elderly. You know, with our you know, increasing the elderly population, it will need more money. But that's not the point. The point, I think, is it's the budgets. This has been driven by, we think, by budgets and the social utility idea and ageism. I mean, what's your view?
I think it's a combination of all of those things, and they're all pretty despicable, quite honestly. And I think we need to have this national debate. I think, you know, the elderly are you know, they are the fonts of a huge amount of wisdom for younger generations, and perhaps someone doesn't want them passing that on.
Yeah. But I also think that, you know, as Kevin Newell said, people are not being looked at as individuals, they're being looked at as numbers by, you know, NHS managers. We also know that one NHS manager said, well, he was approached by a member of his staff who said, oh, this is terrible, isn't all these people dying and they're not dying of COVID? And he said, to paraphrase, well, no, I think that's okay. They're blocking beds, and, you know, they've had a good innings, and I can make these decisions, you know, without comeback now.
Well, it sounds like something we saw about 75 years ago to me.
Exactly. And in fact, Kevin Newell makes that analogy in his presentation. Well, thank you very much. I mean, what do you think needs to be done now?
We need to publicise this. Again, it's another topic that the mainstream media won't want to talk about. There are so many. Once I've dealt with the main, I've got this debate hopefully coming up again now in the main chamber on excess deaths. I think it would be a good topic for me to put in from a German debate to start that off with, a half-hour debate on end-of-life care. And again, I think a lot of MPs should be interested because it's something that affects every constituency and every community, if not, well, ultimately every family.
Mm-hmm. I just wonder, is there any opportunity in that 3-hour debate to bring this up as a?
I did mention NG 163 in my 90-minute, in my 32-minute speech.
I know you did. Yeah.
The whole debate, but I mean that is warranted for a whole debate on its own, as far as I'm concerned. If I'd gone off into that detail at that stage, I mean, I would have taken the whole 90 minutes up and still not had enough time. There is so much out there on this that needs to be exposed, quite honestly, and it is ongoing. So I'm hoping that some of these coroner's inquests that are coming up this year, in the next few months, that they'll have a duty. They have to write to the government and the NHS with their recommendations, and I'm hoping they're recommending that there's a full investigation and a halt to these dangerous protocols, which are certainly effectively euthanasia. And we didn't vote for that. I voted against euthanasia when we had the debate, and it was defeated in the House of Commons, as was, the motion in 2014 to stop and end the Liverpool Care pathway. And if that's been reintroduced by the back door, that is a subversion of our democracy.
Well, I totally agree. And I think it's always been there, Andrew. I think it never, ever ended. I think the practice continued to drive policy, but I think during the pandemic, it went on steroids, and I think thousands were put on this pathway.
And of course, they can be put down as COVID deaths because they suffered with respiratory failure ultimately, because that's the side effects of those drugs, or the effect of those drugs.
Exactly.
It was perfect, really.
I mean, from a legal point of view, I mean, how do you think we approach this? Because I think obviously we as a together, and also Families Against Involuntary Medical Euthanasia, which I'm also a member of, we are calling for an urgent review of these protocols, all these protocols. And obviously that is not going to change things overnight. And also there's the cultural problem, but it's a first step. But we would also like to see more guarantees under the law around informed consent, because the consent is not informed. Doctors and nurses are presenting the alternative of a do not resuscitate, and therefore, possibly the pathway, in not very honest terms. So they're not giving a balanced view of the risks and benefits of the drugs, the pathway, and the alternative of treatment. And they are also denying treatment to people on age. And this is
yeah. And I think there's a cultural problem, which I think we're seeing in Parliament, where, as far as I'm concerned, the MPs, the government, they work for the people. The people don't answer to us; we answer to them. And I think it should have been the same as with medical staff and the NHS, that they should work for us. And what we saw during the pandemic, don't burden the NHS, stay at home, do this, do that, was that we're serving the NHS. The NHS aren't serving the people. Absolutely. And I think we're seeing that in their dealing with the elderly as well. And who are the NHS to judge who aren't worthy to be dealt with? We're in very dangerous territory, and I think we need some transparency around what's going on and some accountability. And I think we will get to the truth. And I think a lot of people out there, they know what the truth is now. And you're right, people are scared to go to hospital, especially if you're elderly and you've got comorbidities, that you'll be scored and you'll be put immediately on a death pathway. That's not a society that I thought I was living in, and it's not one that I want anyone in this country or anywhere around the world to live in. And we're going to have to stop it.